everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that's something that you might want to stick around for, then definitely subscribe. And also please switch on your little notification bell because I've had so many messages and comments recently from people letting me know that YouTube isn't putting my videos in their subscription boxes, which is so annoying. So if you do want to be notified every single time that I post, I do suggest switching on the bell. But anyway, today we are going to be talking about the Yosemite Park serial killer case, and this is kind of part 2 of last week's case. Last week we talked about the abduction of Stephen Stainer, and Stephen's case is connected to this one. If you watched till the end of last week's video, then you'll already know why. But if not, I will obviously explain later on. I do advise that you watch last week's video before this one if you haven't already. You don't have to, but it will give you a bit more of a backstory and a bit more context of this case. I will be giving a brief summary of last week's case at some point in this video, but it will be brief, so I do advise watching last week's before you watch this one. So I will leave that video linked in the corner, I don't know which corner it is, and in the description box if you want to go and watch that. But before getting into today's case, I do just want to say a huge thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring this section of the video. Surfshark is a virtual private network and an app and browser extension that lets you set the location on your phone and laptop to anywhere in the world, and it allows you to access the internet as if you were in that country, giving you easy access to different websites and content that you may not be able to see from your region. Surfshark also gives you that extra layer of security. It protects your online identity as it makes it easier for you to keep your personal data safe, such as your passwords and your photos and your videos. Using Surfshark also means you can access a number of different countries' streaming service libraries, including Netflix. In fact, you can access 15 different Netflix libraries. I actually changed my laptop's location to America, meaning I can access the American Netflix, and I was so excited because the American Netflix actually has the TV show NCIS, which Netflix UK doesn't have. I used to watch NCIS literally all the time with my sister when we were younger. That show is actually what got me interested in like crime and investigation and murder mysteries. I literally love it so much, and now thanks to Surfshark I can watch it whenever I want. Another great thing about having a Surfshark subscription is that one account can be used on an unlimited number of devices, so you can protect all of your devices at once at no extra cost. And they're actually offering you guys the incredible offer of 85% off plus 3 extra months for free when you use the code Mollie. They also offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you want to try it out and just see if a VPN is for you, then there's no risk whatsoever. There will be a link to Surfshark in the description box. I highly suggest you guys check it out. I could not recommend their service enough. Once again, a huge thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring today's video and supporting the channel. And having said all that, let's get into the case of the Yosemite Park serial killer. So this case took place in Mariposa County in California near the Yosemite National Park. Yosemite National Park is a really beautiful area actually. It's in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. Within it lie beautiful waterfalls and valleys and meadows. There's hiking trails, and because it's such a lovely place, people love to visit there all the time. It's literally a tourist hotspot. And in February of 1999, that is exactly what 42-year-old Carole Sund decided to do. Now, Carole was one of 5 children, and her parents were called Frances and Carole, so her mother had the same name as her, and they described their daughter as just being such a helpful and special person. She was always keen to help her local community. I believe she worked with quite a few charities in her life. Carole actually lived in the city of Eureka in Northern California, but in February of 1999, she decided to go on a little mini vacation to the Yosemite National Park. And joining Carole on this little vacation was her 15-year-old daughter named Juli, and Juli's best friend, 16-year-old Silvina Pelosso. Juli and Silvina had known each other literally their entire lives, ever since they were babies. I think that Juli's mother Carole was good friends with Silvina's parents, and so naturally growing up the two were really close. Juli and Silvina, they were the same age and they just had a really nice friendship. Now, Silvina's family were actually from Argentina, and so Carole and Juli wanted to take Silvina on this little vacation to Yosemite National Park to just show her around the area before she had to go home to Argentina. So their trip began on the 12th of February 1999, and the three travelled from their hometown in Eureka to San Francisco, where they picked up a rental car. And they were going to use this rental car on their trip. It was kind of like a road trip they were going on. And this rental car was a red Pontiac Grand Prix. So they were driving around in this rental car, and one of the first places they stopped was actually in Stockton in California, because Juli wanted to have a look around the university there. You see, she was actually a cheerleader and she wanted to learn a bit more about the cheerleading program that they offered there. Following that, Carole, Juli and Silvina made their way to Al Portal in Mariposa County, which is on the western edge of Yosemite, and they arrived there on the 14th of February. Upon arrival, they checked into room 509 at the Cedar Lodge Hotel, which was a very popular hotel for tourists who were visiting the area. Although at the time, I don't believe they had many bookings at all, because it wasn't really the time of year for tourists. So I think Carole, Juli and Silvina were some of the only guests staying in the hotel at the time. The day after checking into the hotel, Carole, Juli and Silvina decided to spend their day exploring the beautiful area of Yosemite. They did a lot of the typical tourist activities together, and they returned to their room at the Cedar Lodge Hotel at around 7:30 p.m. that evening after having dinner at the Cedar Lodge restaurant. The hotel actually had a restaurant. Shortly after arriving back at the hotel, Carole rang her husband. His name was Jens, and she was basically telling him on the phone what their plans were for the next day, which was the 16th. Carole said that she and the girls were going to visit the Yosemite National Park once more the next day, and then afterwards they were going to meet Jens at the San Francisco airport, and they were also due to return their rental car that day. So the next day came around and Jens went to the San Francisco airport, and he waited there for Carole, Juli and Silvina, and he waited and he waited, but they just didn't show up. And this was very unlike Carole Sund, because she was a very organised person. From what I can gather, it was very rare that she was ever late to things. And so because of this reason, her husband Jens thought that maybe he had made a mistake. He thought that maybe he had gotten the time wrong. Maybe he had misunderstood what she had said to him on the phone the previous day. I believe Jens tried to contact Carole a couple of times, but he just couldn't reach her, and so he decided to ring the front desk at the Cedar Lodge Hotel, and he asked the receptionist if the girls had checked out of room 509. But they actually hadn't. So the hotel receptionist headed to room 509 expecting to find the girls inside, but when she went in, they weren't there, although their room key was there, had been left in the room. But the girls weren't in the room, and there was nothing really in their room that appeared like suspicious or alarming, although there were a couple of wet towels on the floor in the bathroom. So it appeared as though the girls had had showers that morning and then just left, but it's really odd that they didn't check out of the hotel. And Carole's husband was growing really concerned, because he had no idea where his wife was and why she hadn't met him at the airport that day, and so eventually he decided to contact the Mariposa County Police Department and report the girls as missing. Immediately, a search began for Carole and Juli Sund and Silvina Pelosso, and this search was huge. There were so many people out looking for the missing girls and their rental car that they hadn't returned. If you remember, they were meant to drop off their rental car in San Francisco that day as well, and they hadn't done that either. Detectives did track down a number of stolen cars in the area to see if any of them were the rental car that Carole had paid for, but none of them were. The car, just like the girls, was nowhere to be found. But then about 4 days after they were last seen, something that belonged to one of the missing women was actually found. About 83 miles away from Yosemite National Park is the city Modesto, and on the 19th of February, a young high school student was walking along a busy road when they noticed something on the ground. It was a wallet insert that contained a couple of credit cards and a driver's license, and this driving license actually belonged to missing woman 42-year-old Carole Sund. Investigators later discovered that one of her credit cards was missing from this wallet insert, so someone had taken that out and then chucked this wallet on the side of the road in Modesto. But why was it found in Modesto? Why was it over 80 miles away from where Carole was last seen? Now, initially in the investigation, detectives didn't actually think that foul play was involved in their disappearances. They didn't think that someone had done something to the girls. One of their first theories was that maybe the girls had just gotten into some kind of accident. Maybe they had crashed their car and were just stuck or something like that. But as time went on, concerns grew for the missing women, and as you can imagine, their families were so worried about them, and Carole Sund's father actually offered a $250,000 reward for information regarding the whereabouts of his daughter and his granddaughter Juli and Silvina. And he also went out searching for the girls himself. He would just drive around Yosemite in his car looking for them, and in his car he had like blankets and rope, just anything that they might need in case he found them. And he wasn't the only one. Like I mentioned before, there were so many people out looking for them. This search was huge. People were checking rivers and hiking trails and along the roadside. Investigators, I believe, used like helicopters to get a better view of the area from above to see if they could spot anything. But still, there was nothing, no trace of them at all. At this point, investigators decided to send a forensic team to room 509 at the Cedar Lodge Hotel, because that was the last confirmed place that the girls were known to have been. So a photographer was sent in to take pictures of the room. Forensics began dusting for fingerprints and collecting hairs, although, as I said before, there was nothing in that room that indicated there was a struggle or that something had happened to the girls there. The room, for the most part, just seemed to be completely normal. There was nothing that was really out of place. There was nothing that stuck out as being odd, apart from one thing. They realised that a pink blanket and a pillowcase were both missing from the room. So these items belonged to the hotel and they were just gone from the room. So where were they? The search for the girls continued, but soon days turned into weeks and people really began losing hope that the girls would be found. They began losing hope that this case would ever be solved because it seemed to be going cold already. And then on the 18th of March 1999, just over a month after the girls were last seen, something was found. That day, a man was walking around a wooded area. I think he was target practicing in Tuolumne County. I'm so not pronouncing that right. Which I believe is about 2 hours away from the Cedar Lodge where the girls were last seen. Anyway, this this man was walking around this wooded area when all of a sudden he came across an abandoned car. But this car had literally been burnt to a crisp. Someone had set this car on fire, and when it was found in the woods, it was literally just this burnt remains of a car. That didn't make sense, but I'll put a picture on the screen. It had clearly been burnt in extreme heat, although you could still see the tiniest bit of red paint left on the car. And if you remember, Carole Sund's rental car was a red Pontiac Grand Prix. The man that found this car in the woods was immediately suspicious because he had heard about the disappearance of the 3 women, and he knew that there was a massive search for them and their rental car, and so he decided to contact the authorities and report what he had found in the woods. So investigators went to look at this car, and they were quickly able to determine from the number plate that it was in fact the same rental car that Carole Sund had borrowed. The license plate was also badly burnt, by the way, but the officers could just about make out the markings on it still, so they knew that it was the rental car. And this was obviously an immediate red flag that something sinister must have happened to the missing women, because the car was found miles and miles away from where they were last seen, and someone had intentionally set it on fire. There were traces of gasoline, by the way, found on the car, so someone had set this car on fire on purpose. So an evidence response team and a forensic team were sent to examine this car, and at the same time a search and rescue team began searching around this wooded area just to see if they could find anything else, any other evidence that may have been dropped or ditched, and they did actually find something. About 60 yards away from the burnt out car, one of the searchers came across a purse or a bag on the ground, and inside this bag there were a couple of disposable cameras and also a credit card and a receipt. This credit card in this bag belonged to Carole Sund, and I believe it was the credit card that was missing from her wallet insert that was found in Modesto. And this receipt was actually from the Cedar Lodge restaurant. If you remember, the night before the girls disappeared, they had dinner at the Cedar Lodge restaurant, and this was the receipt from that meal. So all of this was collected and taken in as evidence. Meanwhile, the investigators and forensic teams were still looking around the burnt out car, and they began looking inside of the car for any evidence, and then they got to the boot of the car, or the trunk, sorry. And when they opened the trunk of this car, they actually found 2 dead bodies that were literally just skeletal remains. And these 2 bodies were later identified through dental records and DNA as being 42-year-old Carole Sund and 16-year-old Argentine student Silvina Pelosso, Juli Sund's best friend. However, Carole's daughter, 15-year-old Juli Sund, was still nowhere to be found. She wasn't in this car with the other 2 bodies, so where was she? Was she still alive and being held captive somewhere, or was she also dead and her body was just somewhere else? As you can imagine, the discovery of these 2 bodies sent so much panic into the local community, because before this case was just a missing persons investigation, but now it was clearly a murder inquiry. It was obvious that foul play was involved in their deaths given how the bodies were found. A killer was clearly on the loose, and the police knew they had to find them quickly before they struck again. And of course, like I said before, 15-year-old Juli Sund still hadn't been found. There was a chance that she was still alive and in danger, and so they needed to locate her as soon as possible. Now, around the area where the car was located, there were a couple of items that I believe belonged to the girls. So I think there were some like shoes and clothes, and this indicated to the investigators that someone had walked away from the scene. Maybe Juli was still alive and had been like led away from the car by someone, and they dropped these items when they walked away. So the search for 15-year-old Juli Sund continued. In the meantime, detectives still had those disposable cameras that were found in that bag near the scene, and it was clear that these cameras belonged to the girls because they developed the film, and these pictures were of all three of the girls doing all of the touristy things around Yosemite National Park before they went missing. I'll put a couple of the pictures on screen now, but it showed them on hikes and going ice skating and just exploring the area really. It's obvious from these pictures that they were having a really nice vacation, and it's just heartbreaking that it ended the way it did. Some of the last pictures on this camera were of Carole, Juli and Silvina in their room 509 on the 15th of February, the day before they were reported missing. About a week after Carole and Silvina's bodies were found, the FBI actually received a letter in the mail that appeared to be from the girl's killer. I say a letter, but it was actually a map, and it wasn't signed or anything obviously, but this map seemed to indicate where Juli Sund's body was. I'll put a picture of this map on screen now. At the top of the paper it says, quote, "We had fun with this one." And then underneath this, a picture of the Lake Don Pedro Reservoir in California was drawn. So the investigators believed that this is where the killer disposed of 15-year-old Juli Sund's body. So detectives went to the Lake Don Pedro area that was drawn on the map with a sniffer dog, and pretty much straight away the dog alerted them to a dead body. The body was found about 30 miles away from where the rental car was found, so about 30 miles away from where Carole and Silvina's bodies were discovered, and this body was next to a tree, and it had been there for over a month. Eventually this body was identified through dental records as being 15-year-old Juli Sund, and her killer had actually cut her throat. Juli's body actually had some pink fibres on it, and these pink fibres were believed to have come from that pink blanket that was missing from room 509 of the Cedar Lodge. Investigators also sent the map that the killer had drawn and the envelope that it came in off for forensic testing, and they discovered that on the stamp of the letter there was actually a partial fingerprint. And on the envelope flap, so like this part of the envelope that you lick, they also found some male DNA, so they obviously kept that as evidence. Now, just as a side note, for a while in this investigation, the police did actually have a couple of main suspects in the case. They believed they knew who had done this to the girls. The suspects were two men who were actually half brothers, and they were called Eugene Dykes and Michael Lorick. And according to a couple of sources, their phone records showed that they had actually tried to hack into Carole Sund's bank account. And these two men, Eugene and Michael, were violent men. They had been involved with the police several times before. They had been arrested and convicted of various charges, including drug use, violence towards women, and sexual assault. At the time they were being looked into as suspects in this case, they were already in custody on charges unrelated to this crime, but they were being questioned about this incident. Now, one of the brothers, Michael Lorick, just denied having any involvement in the girls' cases. He said that it wasn't him and he didn't know anything about it. Whereas the other brother, Eugene Dykes, actually had a completely different story, and he said that he actually was involved in the girls' disappearances. Eugene claimed that he and his half-brother Michael had kidnapped Carole and Juli Sund and Silvina Pelosso from room 509 and killed them. And the police believed him. They really believed that they had the guys, and they even announced to the public that they believed they knew who had done this. And so for a while the public felt safe again. They thought that the perpetrators were behind bars and that they couldn't hurt anyone else. But they were wrong, because eventually the police began doubting this story. They doubted Eugene because they realized that a lot of what he was saying about the case didn't actually match up to any of the evidence that they had gathered. These two men weren't actually the killers. I believe all they were guilty of in this specific case was trying to hack into Carole's bank account. They were just hackers. And you're probably thinking, well, then why did Eugene admit to it? And honestly, I'm wondering the same thing. I have no idea why he would admit to a crime that he didn't commit. Although saying that, this isn't the first time I've come across something like this, where someone has admitted to something they didn't do. It isn't that uncommon. Some criminals do admit to crimes that they didn't commit because to them it's almost like something to brag about and be proud of, which is disgusting, but like I said, not unheard of. I've definitely covered cases before where criminals or killers have admitted to crimes that they didn't do because they want to be notorious. And it seems as though this is what happened in this case. Eugene admitted to the murders even though he didn't do them, and neither did his half-brother Michael. We know who the real killer is. Well, you guys don't know yet, but you will find out later on, and it wasn't them. But anyway, in July of 1999, it had been about 5 months since the murders of Carole and Juli Sund and Silvina Pelosso, and still no one had been charged with their deaths. At this point, I believe detectives were still looking into Eugene and Michael as the prime suspects. Like I said earlier, they were already in jail and in custody on separate charges. They thought they had the killers behind bars, so it was a huge shock when another murder occurred in Yosemite. This time the victim was 26-year-old Joie Armstrong, and she actually lived in a cabin in an area in Yosemite National Park. Joie was a naturalist, she was a nature guide, and she worked for the Yosemite Institute, and she would take young children and adults on nature hikes and like little adventures around the area, kind of like a tourist guide. It was the 21st of July 1999, and that afternoon Joie was alone in her cabin and she was packing a few things because she was actually planning on going on a backpacking trip with a couple of her friends to the city of Sausalito in California. So she was gathering all of her things that she was going to take with her, and she was putting them in her Toyota truck, which was just outside of her cabin. I believe Joie was supposed to be meeting her friends in Sausalito later that same day. However, she just never showed up. And she also hadn't contacted her friends either to let them know that like maybe she had changed her mind. They just hadn't heard from her. Her friends were immediately concerned, and so they decided to, I believe, contact the authorities in Yosemite and just ask them if they could do a welfare check, if they could just go to Joie's cabin and just check that she was okay. So a couple of officers went to Joie's cabin, and the first thing they noticed was that her Toyota truck was still parked outside. So it looked like she was still home. It looked like she hadn't gone anywhere. So they walked up to the cabin and they see that the front door was actually open. However, when they went inside, Joie Armstrong wasn't in there. She was nowhere to be found. However, it was clear to the officers that something had happened to her inside this cabin, because I believe there was actually blood found in there, and it just looked like there was a struggle. It looked like Joie had been trying to fight someone off. So a search began for 26-year-old Joie Armstrong, and it didn't take long for them to find her. Just a few hundred yards from her cabin, her dead body was found partially submerged in a creek. However, her killer had actually decapitated her. So when her body was found, she was just headless and her head was nowhere to be seen. Now, I believe Joie's mother had been informed that her daughter was missing and that a body had been found. At the time, they hadn't identified the body yet, so they didn't know for certain that it was her. Investigators were pretty sure that it was going to be her because she was missing missing, and this body was found so close to her cabin, but of course they can't be sure until she's been identified through like DNA or dental records. But anyway, the authorities contacted Joie's mother, and she had decided to travel to Yosemite where all of this was happening. And remember, at this point all she knew was that her daughter was missing and that a body had been found. That was all that she knew. And when she was on her way to Yosemite, she saw a newspaper, and the headline on this newspaper read, quote, "Yosemite naturalist beheaded." That was how she found out that her daughter had been decapitated. I honestly cannot imagine the pain she must have felt reading that. To learn that your daughter has been murdered is horrific in itself, but to find out via a newspaper that she was beheaded is insane. Joie Armstrong's head was later found not far from where her body was discovered, and it was at the bottom of like a small pool of water. So the hunt was on to find Joie's killer, and investigators began looking around her cabin. They collected samples of blood and I believe also like hair and fingernail samples for testing. They also noticed that outside of her cabin there were tire prints on her lawn and in some sand. And these tire prints were not from Joie's Toyota car, they were from a different vehicle. They also realised from looking at these tire impressions that the vehicle that had made these impressions had two different sets of tyres. So the tyres were not all the same make or tread, if that makes sense. The tyres were not all the same. I'm sorry, that was really badly explained, but I don't know much about cars at all, or tyres. Alongside these tyre impressions, detectives also noticed some footwear markings on the ground that again didn't appear to belong to Joie. So if these footwear markings weren't Joie's, and these tyre impressions on the lawn and in the sand weren't from Joie's car, then whose were they?
We realized that there was one vehicle there that had two different sets of tires on it. So that was pretty unique. And then we also noticed that there were two sets of footwear impressions, and they were side by side. And it was as if someone pushed down into the sand to force somebody up into a vehicle.
So pictures of these impressions were taken and they were collected as evidence. They also took pictures of the scene where Joie's body was discovered, and from just looking at her body, it appeared as though she had been sexually assaulted, or at least her killer had tried to sexually assault her, because her top had been pulled up and her pants or trousers had been unbuttoned. So for this reason, it appeared that the motive for the murder was probably sexual. During the investigation into Joie's murder, the detectives were obviously carrying out interviews and they were questioning several people, and I think they were, at this point, they were looking into the possibility that maybe Joie's murder was linked to the murders of Carole and Juli Sund and Silvina Pelosso that had occurred about 5 months earlier. Maybe the person responsible for killing Carole, Juli and Silvina was also responsible for killing Joie. The police did actually have quite a few witnesses come forward, and these witnesses said that they saw a light blue International Scout vehicle driving around the area where Joie's cabin was on the same day that she was murdered. And one of these witnesses said that he actually saw this car parked right outside of Joie's cabin before she vanished. So the police were obviously now thinking that this was a very credible lead. They thought that there was a high chance that whoever was driving this vehicle was Joie's killer. They just had to find it. That afternoon, a National Park ranger and an officer actually came across a car that matched the description to the one the witnesses saw around Joie's cabin. This vehicle was parked near a stream just outside Yosemite Park near El Portal, and next to it, there was a man sat on the ground. This man, I believe, had his top off. One source I read said that he was completely naked, but I think he was like sunbathing or something, and he was also smoking marijuana. So the officer approaches this man and he begins speaking to him, and this man explains that he was just enjoying his day off from work. This man was 37-year-old Carole Stainer, and if you watched last week's video, you may recognize his name. He worked as a maintenance guy or handyman at the Cedar Lodge Hotel in El Portal, the same hotel that murder victims Carole Sund, Juli Sund and Silvina Pelosso were staying in before they disappeared. And just as a side note, Carrie was actually questioned about the disappearances of the 3 women when it happened, because obviously he worked at the hotel they were staying in. I think like all the staff members were questioned, but he was very calm and cooperative with the police, and they just weren't suspicious of him really. He even offered to help them look for the missing pink blanket and the pillowcase that was gone from room 509. But yeah, the police weren't really suspicious of him in the cases of Carole, Juli and Silvina. I don't think he had a previous criminal record. I believe he may have been arrested before for possession of drugs, but as far as I'm aware, he was never arrested for like any kind of violent behavior. To be honest, most people who knew him just said that he was a really nice, normal guy. However, now he was looking quite suspicious because he had the same car that was seen outside Joey's cabin on the day that she was killed. And I actually read on one source that there were only 2 of these particular vehicles registered in the area at the time, so it was a very unique vehicle in that area. It's not like there were hundreds of these vehicles that the police had to track down. There were literally 2 of these vehicles in this area, and Carole Stainer owned one of them. But anyway, going back to before, so the officer was just chatting to Carrie and they asked him if they could have a look round his truck. I just realized I've been calling it a car, but it looked more like, it was more like a truck or like a Jeep really. Anyway, they were looking around this truck and they were looking inside of it, and they noticed that inside he had a backpack, and he was pretty reluctant to let them look inside of it, and so they decided to just try and get a search warrant so that they could search this backpack without having his permission, because he didn't want them to look inside of it. And in the meantime, they were kind of done with this man. Obviously, they couldn't arrest him for anything because the only suspicious thing about him so far was the fact that he had the same car that the witnesses saw, but that doesn't directly link him to Joey's murder, and so they had to just let him go. However, later that same day, detectives decide to go and speak to Carole Stainer again. They go straight to the Cedar Lodge Hotel because not only did he work there as a handyman, but he actually lived there as well. He lived in an apartment above the Cedar Lodge restaurant on the 2nd floor. They were just speaking to him about Joie Armstrong's case, and he said that he was nowhere near the area where she was killed, even though I believe he was actually seen in the vicinity by a couple of police officers that day. So it seemed as though he was lying about where he was, but why? If you've got nothing to hide, why lie? So whilst the detectives were speaking to Carrie inside of his apartment, they got another agent to take some more pictures of his vehicle, but more specifically the tyres of his vehicle, because if you remember, outside of Joey's cabin there were tyre impressions on the lawn and in the sand, and these tyre impressions were from 2 different sets of tyres. So they wanted to see if they could match the tread of the tyres on Carrie's vehicle to the impressions of the tyres in the sand and on the lawn, if that makes sense. So they took these pictures of Carrie's tyres and they went away to compare the photos, and they found that the tyre impressions outside Joey's cabin were a perfect match to the tyre tread on Carey's car. It was Carey Stayner's vehicle outside Joey's cabin that day, despite him claiming that he wasn't anywhere near that area. And so on July the 22nd, the detectives decide to question Carey again, but this time they wanted him to come into the police station for questioning. So they went to the Cedar Lodge, just expecting him to be there, expecting him to be working that day. But he wasn't there. He was nowhere to be found. And obviously this was a potentially very dangerous man. They needed to find him quickly. And so an announcement was made which urged people to look out for this man because he was a person of interest in the murder of 26-year-old Joie Armstrong. Eventually the detectives received a tip from a member of the public, and they said that Carey Stayner was staying at a nudist camp near Sacramento. So on July the 24th, a couple of FBI agents go to this nudist camp to pick up Carey. And interestingly, as soon as he sees the detectives approaching him, he stands up and he puts his hands above his head, almost like he is surrendering, which the detectives just thought was a little bit odd. But anyway, he was arrested and he was taken in for questioning. When they arrive at the police station, they take Carey's fingerprints and they take mugshots of him, and I believe before the questioning started, he was due to be taking a polygraph test, which is like a lie detector test. However, before it started, Carey Stayner actually asked if he could speak to one of the agents named Jeff Reinick in private first. And so Agent Jeff Reinick agrees and he sits down in a room with Carey, and Carey starts saying to Jeff stuff like, "Oh, I'm a really bad person, I've done bad things, I'm not a good person." And then he says something along the lines of, "Sometimes I think about love and peace, and then something switches and I think about killing everyone in the world." And as they continued talking, Carey Stayner eventually admitted to murdering 26-year-old Joie Armstrong. And surprisingly, he also admitted to the murders of 42-year-old Carole Sund, her 15-year-old daughter Juli Sund, and 16-year-old Silvina Pelosso that happened about 5 months before. He had just admitted to 4 murders, making him a serial killer. But before we talk about his confession, let me just tell you a little bit more about 37-year-old Carey Stayner and his background and his upbringing and stuff like that. So Carey Anthony Stayner was born on the 13th of August 1961 in Merced in California. He had 4 siblings. He had 3 sisters named Cindy, Jody and Corey, and he also had a younger brother named Stephen, and his parents were called Kay and Dalbert Stayner. Now I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because if you watched last week's video you will know all of this already, but when Carey was around 11 years old, his younger brother Stephen, who was 7 years old at the time, was kidnapped by a paedophile named Kenneth Parnell, and he was held captive for 7 years. And as you can imagine, this changed everything for the Stayner family. Their whole world was turned upside down. Carey found life really difficult when his brother went missing, as any sibling would. He was actually really close to his younger brother, and he used to wish on a star almost every night that his little brother would come back home. But as well as this, Carey also felt almost neglected by his parents when Stephen disappeared. Obviously, a lot of their time was spent searching for their son, and so naturally they didn't really have time for their other children. They were a lot less affectionate towards their other children when Stephen disappeared, and I don't think they were really very affectionate parents anyway, but now they were just a lot colder towards them. In fact, it's believed that Carey thought that his father Dalbert had wished that he was the one to go missing instead of Stephen. He wished that Carey had disappeared and not Stephen. Obviously, we don't know if that's true. We don't know if Dalbert really did think that, but Carrie thought that he did. Now, Carrie actually had a disorder called trichotillomania, which is a hair-pulling disorder. And I believe this started when he was around the age of 7. He would just pull clumps of his hair out when he got stressed or agitated. And this carried on throughout the rest of his childhood and teenage years, I believe, which meant that he had quite a lot of bald patches on his head. So to hide this, Carrie would always wear a hat. In his youth, you would never see him without a hat on his head because he was embarrassed about what was underneath. And he would tell the other kids that he just wore a hat all the time because he was going bald like his father. But in reality, he was actually pulling his own hair out. He was also diagnosed as having high functioning autism. And in general, he was just a very quiet and shy kid. I believe he had a couple of friends in school that really liked him, and he seemed to get along with people pretty well. His peers at school actually really admired Carrie's artwork. He was really good at drawing cartoons. He would draw them for the school newspaper, and I think when he was younger, that was his dream job, to be a cartoonist. But underneath all of this, Carrie Stayner had a dark side, even when he was a child. In fact, he himself said that he had thoughts about killing people when he was around 7 or 8 years old. So this all started before his brother went missing. He would play games a lot with his sisters and his cousins, and he would like role play with them. I say games, but he would like literally attack them and choke them. And he would get like tomato sauce and put it all over them and pretend it was their blood. It was like he was acting out his violent fantasies. He would also pretend to hypnotize his sisters and his cousins, and he would tell them to undress in front of him. But even when he wasn't playing these games with them, he would watch them undress. His cousin actually said that she would have to be careful when she was getting changed. She would have to make sure that she checked that Carrie wasn't like lurking around or looking through the window, because that was something he did a lot. Now, Carrie himself says that when he was 11 years old, he was molested by an uncle of his whilst they were on a camping trip. Although I don't believe Carrie ever told anyone at the time. Actually, I don't think he ever told anyone for years and years. And so the uncle, as far as I'm aware, was never like arrested or charged or anything. But we'll talk more about his uncle in a minute. Around that same time when Carrie was 11 is when his younger brother Stephen was abducted. And then 7 years later, he escaped his abductor and returned home to Merced when Carrie was about 18 years old. And I talked about this in last week's video, but when Stephen returned, he honestly became like a celebrity in California. His case had so much media attention. He was on every newspaper and magazine. Everyone wanted to interview him. They all thought that he was a hero because he actually rescued a 5-year-old boy named Timothy White from suffering the same fate he did. The reason Stephen had come home was because his abductor, Kenneth Parnell, had abducted another child, Timothy White, and Stephen was just like, I can't watch this boy, Timothy, go through the abuse that I went through, and so he decided to take him home. He risked everything to save this little boy, and everyone just thought he was a hero because of it. Like I said, he was literally like a celebrity in California, and some people believe that his older brother Carrie was jealous of this, jealous of the attention that his younger brother was getting. And the two, Stephen and Carrie, didn't get along very well when Stephen came home. They had to share a room with each other, and they both found that really difficult. When he came home, Stephen found it really difficult to adjust to his new life and follow the rules of the Stayner household. And Carrie didn't like that. He didn't like that Stephen wouldn't obey their parents' rules. Stephen Stainer actually passed away in 1989 when he was 24 years old after he was in a motorcycle accident. And by this point, his older brother Carey was a drug user, and he was also working in a job where he fixed car windshields, I think. And at the time, he was actually living with the uncle that he claimed molested him when he was 11. And then one day in the year 1990, this uncle was suddenly murdered. Carey told the authorities that he just came home one day and he found his uncle dead in the house that they lived in together, and he had been shot with his own gun. The case was never officially solved, although a lot of people suspect that Carey actually killed his uncle that day. Following this, he moved in with one of his sisters, Corey, although I don't believe he lived with her for very long because she actually caught him hiding a video camera in her bathroom, so that every time she would take a shower, the camera would record it and he could watch this footage of his sister having a shower. At one point, he was actually in a mental health facility, but then he left there when he got a job working as the handyman at the Cedar Lodge Hotel in El Portal. And that brings us back to where we were before in the case. So if you remember, 37-year-old Carey Stainer was arrested on July the 24th, 1999, and he was taken to the police station for questioning. There, he confessed to Agent Jeff Reinick that not only had he killed 26-year-old Joie Armstrong, but he had also murdered 42-year-old Carole Sund, her 15-year-old daughter Juli Sund, and their 16-year-old friend Silvina Pelosso in February of 1999. So he first began telling Agent Reinick about the day he murdered Joie Armstrong. Carey said that that day in July of 1999, he had gone to Yosemite because he wanted to search for Bigfoot. And at some point, he came across Joie Armstrong. He spotted her packing her things into her Toyota car outside her cabin, and in that moment, he decided that he was going to kidnap and kill her. So he goes up to Joie and he starts talking to her. They have like a short conversation and then he walks back to his truck and Joie continues packing her car. But Carey doesn't go to his truck to like leave and drive away. He actually goes there to pick up what he called his abduction kit. This abduction kit was, I believe, the backpack that he was reluctant to let the police search, and in this backpack was some duct tape, a knife and a gun. So he grabs his backpack and he takes his gun out of it and he walks up to Joie from behind, grabs her and forces her into her cabin. Once they're inside the cabin, he uses the duct tape in his backpack to bind her and then he forces her to get into his truck. He starts driving away with Joie in the truck. However, Joie actually manages to escape and she literally throws herself out of the passenger window and starts running for her life. But Carey is behind her, running after her, and eventually he catches her. Joie Armstrong really put up a fight for her life that day. She was struggling with him so much. She was really trying to fight this man off, and he actually said the reason her death was so violent was because he was so mad at her for trying to fight him off. Carey got out his knife and he slit Joie's throat, and then, as we know, he decapitated her and he disposed of her head at the bottom of a pool of water not far from her body. And it was easy for the detectives to link him to Joie's murder. There was a lot of evidence that it was him, including his confession now. And I actually read on one source that one of the pieces of evidence linking him to the crime was a red mechanic's hat that was found in her cabin that belonged to Carey Stainer. He literally left his hat at the crime scene. After he confessed to Joie's murder, he then proceeded to confess to the murders of Carole, Juli and Silvina, although this crime actually has a bit more of a backstory, because originally Carrie set out to murder 3 other people rather than Carole, Juli and Silvina. So by this point, before the murders of Carole, Juli and Silvina, Carrie had been imagining what it would be like to sexually assault and kill women for years and years, and he finally decided to turn these fantasies into reality. He was going to murder. And in February of 1999, Carrie actually had a girlfriend whose name I don't know, I couldn't find her name, but she was a waitress at the Cedar Lodge restaurant, and she had 2 young daughters. And her daughters were young. I believe they were both under 10 years old. And Carrie began thinking about assaulting and killing all 3 of them. So killing his girlfriend and killing his girlfriend's daughters. And in February of 1999, just the day before Carole, Silvina and Juli were killed, he set his plan in motion. He went to his girlfriend's home intent on murdering her and her family. However, when he got there, there was actually another adult there. I think there was a man there, and so his plan failed. But he wasn't going to give up. He had decided that he was going to murder, and so he went back to the Cedar Lodge Hotel and he started looking around the rooms to see if he could find any other women that he could abduct and kill. And soon he came across room 509 where Carole, Juli and Silvina were staying, and he could see them through the curtain. It was open ever so slightly. So he knocks on the door of room 509 and Carole shouts out and she asks who it is before she opens it. And Carrie replied saying that he was the handyman of the hotel and that he had to come in to repair a leak in the bathroom. And Carole was a little bit hesitant to let him in at first, but eventually she does let him. She lets him into the room and he walks into the bathroom and pretends that he is looking for a leak, but then he grabs his gun and he points it at the girls. He ties all 3 of them up, and a couple of sources state that he put the 2 teenagers, Silvina and Juli, in the bathroom and shut the door, and then he strangled 42-year-old Carole Sund to death in the bedroom. He then put Carole's body in the trunk of their rental car and returns to the 2 girls. He brings the girls out into the bedroom and starts trying to sexually assault them. However, he gets frustrated with 16-year-old Silvina because she was so hysterical. She was crying, obviously, because she was terrified. And so he takes Silvina into the bathroom and he strangles her to death in the bathtub and places her body also in the trunk of the rental car. So now 16-year-old Juli is the only one left alive, and he decides to keep her that way for a little while. Carrie sexually assaults Juli in the bedroom and then he attempts to clean up the crime scene a little. If you remember from earlier on in the video, when the girls disappeared, the hotel receptionist actually went to room 509 to check if they were there, and she found a load of wet towels on the floor, and this was Carrie. He had done this to the towels. He had got them wet and then put them on the floor to make it look like the girls had just showered that morning and then left. So he sorted out the crime scene, and then when morning came, he grabbed the pink blanket that was missing from the hotel, and he wrapped it around Juli Sund. And he also takes a pillowcase with him. I'm not sure why he took the pillowcase actually. I'm guessing it was probably for Juli's head to like cover her face, because obviously she was still alive at this point and he wouldn't have wanted people to see her face. So I'm guessing that's why he took the pillowcase. But anyway, he grabs this pillowcase, he wraps Juli in this blanket, and then he puts her in the passenger seat of the rental car and they drive away. And I actually don't know if Juli knew that the bodies of her mother and her best friend were in the trunk of the car that she was in. I'm guessing that she probably did, which is heartbreaking. I cannot imagine how terrified this poor girl must have been. She probably knew what had happened to her mother and best friend by this point. She probably knew that they were dead, and she probably knew that the same was going to happen to her. So Carey drives the car to Lake Don Pedro, which is where Juli's body was eventually found, and there he kills her as well. After killing Julie, he drives the rental car to a wooded area, and then he calls a taxi to take him back to the Cedar Lodge Hotel. 2 days later, he returns to where he left the rental car with some gasoline, and he covers this car in gasoline and sets it on fire, with Carole and Silvina's bodies still inside the trunk. He also took Carole's wallet insert and threw it on the side of a road in Modesto, which, if you remember, that's where it was later found by a teenager. And he said that he threw it in Modesto to try and throw the detectives off his scent. He also admitted to drawing the map of Julie's resting place at Lake Don Pedro and sending this map to the FBI. And he said that he actually paid a boy to spit in a cup so that he could use someone else's saliva to seal the envelope. He was very clever with that, actually. He knew a lot about like DNA and forensic testing and technology because he was fascinated by murders and serial killers, and he would read about them a lot. He had really thought about how he was going to throw the detectives off his scent, and if you remember, he also wrote on the map, quote, "We had fun with this one." And he said that he did that to make the detectives think that there were two killers involved in the murders of Carole, Julie and Silvina, and they did. They thought it was those two half-brothers. Although he did actually slip up on one thing, he clearly didn't think about fingerprints because his was found on the stamp of the letter. In his confession, Cary Stayner said that after he killed Carole, Julie and Silvina, he was so scared. Even though he tried to get rid of as much evidence as he could, he thought that it was only a matter of time before he would be caught and arrested. But as time went on, he started to think that he had gotten away with it, and he got so confident that he decided to kill again. And so just 5 months later, in July of 1999, he murdered Joie Armstrong. 37-year-old Cary Stayner was charged with all 4 murders, and although he confessed to each one of them, he decided to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. So the case went to trial, and the defense claimed that because he had mental health issues and because he had been molested as a child, he couldn't be held responsible for his actions. But that wasn't enough to sway the jury, and so on August the 27th, 2002, Cary Stayner was found guilty of the murders of 42-year-old Carole Sund, her daughter 15-year-old Juli Sund, and 16-year-old Silvina Pelosso. And he was also found guilty for the murder of 26-year-old Joie Armstrong. For the murder of Joie Armstrong, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And for the murders of Carole, Julie and Silvina, he was actually sentenced to death. He was given the death penalty. And I believe that the reason he wasn't given the death penalty sentence for Joie's murder was because Joie's mother didn't actually agree with it. She didn't agree with the death penalty, and so he was given a life sentence for that instead. As of today, Cary Stayner still sits on death row awaiting his execution. He is around 58 years old now, I believe, and he is in a prison in California. And that is the end of this case. That is kind of part 2 of this 2-part series. If you've watched both parts and made it all the way to the end, then definitely let me know in the comments, and let me know what you think of this case as a whole. It's just a really crazy case as a whole. Like, one brother is a hero and one is a serial killer. But yeah, that's the end of this case. That is the case of the Yosemite Park killer. Like I said before, definitely let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Before I go, I do just want to say a huge thank you to Surfshark once again for sponsoring this video. Remember to use the code Mollie for 80% 25% off plus 3 extra months for 3. There will be a link to Surfshark in the description box. I also just want to give a special shout out to the members of my Patreon page. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else wants to become a member of our little Patreon family, then the link is always in the description box of my videos. Please do give this video a thumbs up and also subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye guys!